The text message lit up my phone at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other. Pack your bags by 9 p.m. At midnight, the locks change. My son Derek's words stared back at me from the screen, cold and final. 28 years I'd lived in this house, raised him in the bedroom upstairs with the squeaky floorboard by the window. Now he wanted me gone in less than 6 hours. But there was something Derek didn't know about the brass key ring sitting in my jewelry box, something that might just change everything tonight. The key ring had belonged to my late husband Tom's mother, passed down when she died 3 years ago. Derek thought he knew every detail about this house, every legal document, every deed transfer. Subscribe and comment your city or state if you've ever had family turn on you like this. He'd been different since marrying that woman Cassandra, colder, more calculating. But some secrets run deeper than a son's new loyalties, and this particular secret was about to surface in ways he never expected. Walking into the kitchen, I noticed the coffee mug still sitting in the sink from this morning. Derek had stopped by around 8 a.m., rifling through papers on the counter while I made breakfast. He'd seemed nervous then, checking his phone every few minutes and avoiding eye contact when I asked about his weekend plans. Now his ultimatum made perfect sense. The timing wasn't random at all. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out the manila folder from the drawer next to the refrigerator. Inside were copies of documents Derek assumed I'd never seen, never understood. The quitclaim deed dated March 15th, 2021. The power of attorney, forms with my signature that looked remarkably like mine, but felt wrong somehow. The property assessment showing this house valued at $437,000 as of last December. Each page told a story Derek thought I was too old and trusting to piece together. But mothers know their children better than anyone, even when those children think they've grown beyond recognition. Derek had been asking strange questions for months about my plans for the future and whether I'd considered assisted living options. He'd brought up my age more frequently, suggesting I was becoming forgetful when I misplaced my reading glasses or couldn't remember which day the garbage trucks came. Looking back, every conversation had been laying groundwork for this moment, this calculated push to get me out of my own home. The brass key ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the window above the sink. Most people would see 3 ordinary house keys, nothing special about them at all. But the smallest key, tarnished and worn smooth from decades of use, opened something Derek didn't even know existed, something his grandmother had shown me just once, making me promise to keep the secret until the right time came. That time was apparently now, with 4 hours and 43 minutes until my supposed eviction. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, each step creaking in the familiar pattern I'd memorized over nearly 3 decades. The jewelry box sat on Tom's old dresser, untouched since his funeral 2 years ago. Inside, beneath my wedding ring and my mother's pearl earrings, the duplicate key ring waited exactly where I'd left it. 2 identical sets of keys, but only I knew why Tom's mother had insisted on making copies of everything, especially that smallest key that looked so unremarkable. Derek's car pulled into the driveway at exactly 5:15 p.m., right on schedule. Through the bedroom window, I watched him and Cassandra climb out, both carrying empty cardboard boxes and wearing the grim expressions of people about to do something unpleasant but necessary. Cassandra held a clipboard, probably filled with legal documents and timelines. They thought they held all the cards in this game, but they were about to learn that some hands aren't revealed until the final moment. The doorbell rang twice, sharp and impatient. Derek's voice carried through the front door, muffled but clear enough. "Mom, we need to talk. I know this is hard, but we've gone over this. The memory care facility has an opening tonight, and honestly, it's better this way." Memory care facility. So that was their story, their justification for stealing my home. Paint the elderly woman as confused and helpless, swoop in as the responsible son, and walk away with a $400,000 house. Almost brilliant, if not for one crucial oversight. Opening the door, I faced them with what I hoped looked like resigned acceptance. Derek avoided my eyes, focusing instead on adjusting his wedding ring, a nervous habit he'd developed since marrying Cassandra 6 months ago. She, however, met my gaze directly, her smile practiced and sympathetic in the way of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. The clipboard in her hands contained at least a dozen pages, each one designed to make this transition seem legal, proper, and inevitable. "Mrs. Henderson," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We've arranged everything. The facility is lovely, and you'll have your own room with a view of their garden. Derek's been worried about you living alone here, especially after that incident last month when you forgot to turn off the stove." I remembered no such incident, but arguing would only reinforce their narrative. Instead, I nodded slowly, playing the role of the confused mother who'd finally seen reason. Derek finally looked at me, guilt flickering across his features before hardening into resolve. "Mom, I know this feels sudden, but we've been discussing this for months. You agreed last week that this was probably for the best, remember?" His lie came so smoothly, I almost admired the skill behind it. But every word he spoke was digging his hole deeper, creating evidence of deception that would matter very soon. The brass keyring in my pocket felt warm against my palm, a reminder that this performance had a predetermined ending. The boxes they'd brought were small, clearly intended for personal items rather than a lifetime's worth of possessions. Cassandra consulted her clipboard and announced that a moving company would handle the larger items tomorrow, though she didn't specify where those items would be going. Derek nodded along, adding that they'd take care of everything so I wouldn't have to worry about the details. Their efficiency was impressive, their planning thorough, their execution nearly flawless. But as they began directing me toward what I should pack first, I noticed Derek's eyes kept drifting to the antique secretary desk in the corner of the living room. Tom's grandmother's desk, with its dozens of small drawers and hidden compartments, had fascinated Derek as a child. He'd spent hours trying to figure out all its secrets, but some compartments stayed locked no matter how hard he tried. Now, at 26 years old, he was still wondering what treasures might be hiding inside. The secretary desk had been in Tom's family for over a century, crafted by a furniture maker in 1893 who specialized in pieces with concealed storage. Tom's grandmother had been particularly fond of hiding important documents in places only she could access, a habit that had seemed quaint and old-fashioned when she was alive. But as Derek's plan unfolded around me, her paranoia about keeping secrets felt remarkably prescient. Cassandra's phone buzzed, and she stepped away to take the call, leaving Derek and me alone for the first time since his ultimatum. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly rehearsing whatever speech he planned to deliver about difficult decisions and my best interests. But before he could speak, I pulled the brass key ring from my pocket and held it where he could see it. The change in his expression was immediate and unmistakable. "Where did you get those?" Derek's voice was sharper now, the careful sympathy replaced by something closer to alarm. He recognized the keys, of course. He'd seen them countless times in his grandmother's hands, watched her use them to lock and unlock drawers he was never allowed to explore. But he'd assumed they were lost when she died, buried with her, or thrown away with the other remnants of her long life. The possibility that I might have them, might have always had them, clearly hadn't occurred to him. Walking to the secretary desk, I inserted the smallest key into a nearly invisible lock hidden behind the decorative molding. The tiny drawer slid open with a soft click, revealing a space barely large enough for a few folded documents. Derek leaned closer despite himself, curiosity overcoming his carefully maintained control. Inside the drawer were photocopies of the same documents he'd been using to justify my eviction, but with one crucial difference. The dates were wrong. The real power of attorney was dated 2 months before Derek claimed I'd signed it, back when Tom was still alive and mentally competent. The signature was clearly Tom's, not mine, and it specifically stated that any property transfers required both our signatures or, in the event of one spouse's death, approval from the surviving spouse and an independent legal witness. Derek's forged version conveniently omitted these requirements, making it appear that he had sole authority to make decisions about my living situation. "This is impossible," Derek whispered, though his voice carried no real conviction. He knew exactly how possible it was, how carefully he and Cassandra had planned each step of their deception. But they'd underestimated both his grandmother's thoroughness and my willingness to play along until I had enough evidence to prove their fraud. The photocopies in the drawer were dated and notarized, legal proof that Derek's documents were fabricated. Cassandra ended her phone call and returned to find Derek staring at the open drawer like it contained a venomous snake. Her composure cracked for just a moment when she saw the papers in my hands, but she recovered quickly, that practiced smile returning to her features. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm not sure what those documents are, but our legal advisor assured us that everything we're doing today is completely legitimate. Perhaps you're confused about which papers are which." The condescension in her voice was exactly what I'd been waiting for, the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate their true intentions. I pulled out my phone and showed them the recording app that had been running since they'd arrived, capturing every word of their performance. Cassandra's face went white, while Derek sank into the nearest chair, finally understanding that their carefully orchestrated plan had been turned against them. "The real question," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm, "is what happens next. The recording proves conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and theft of property. The documents prove forgery and falsification of legal records. Your text message this afternoon proves intent to forcibly remove me from my own home under false pretenses. I'd say you both have some difficult choices ahead." Derek's phone buzzed with a text message, and the blood drained from his face as he read it. "The locksmith is here," he said quietly. "I told him to change the locks at midnight." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The man Derek had hired to lock me out of my own home was about to become a witness to his attempted fraud. Sometimes justice arrives with perfect timing and a bitter sense of humor. But revenge wasn't what I wanted, despite how tempting it felt in that moment. Derek was still my son, still the little boy who'd helped me bake cookies every Sunday and who'd cried when his goldfish died. Cassandra was the architect of this scheme, the one who'd poisoned his mind against his own mother. She was also the one whose greed would ultimately destroy their marriage, though Derek didn't know it yet. The small drawer in the secretary desk had more secrets to reveal, documents that would shift the balance of power permanently. Tom's grandmother had been more than cautious about protecting her family's interests. She'd been downright prophetic about the kinds of people who might try to exploit trust and blood relationships for financial gain. The next set of papers would make Derek's betrayal feel even more bitter. Unfolding the final document from the drawer, I showed them the codicil to Tom's will that neither of them had ever seen. It specifically addressed any attempts by family members to have me declared incompetent or to force me from the house through legal manipulation. In such cases, the document stated, my inheritance would immediately transfer to St. Catherine's Children's Hospital, leaving Derek with nothing but his legal bills and his conscience. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of Derek's choices and their consequences. Cassandra was already calculating her exit strategy. I could see it in her eyes. She'd married Derek for his expected inheritance, not for love or companionship. Now that the inheritance was threatened, their relationship had no foundation left to support it. The clipboard in her hands suddenly seemed much less important. Derek looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was 12 years old and had broken my favorite vase while playing baseball in the house. Part guilt, part fear, part desperate hope that somehow this could all be forgiven and forgotten. But some betrayals cut too deep for simple apologies to heal. Trust, once shattered, takes years to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. "Mom," he started, then stopped, seeming to realize that no words could undo what he'd attempted. The recording on my phone contained enough evidence to destroy his reputation, his marriage, and quite possibly his freedom. But more than that, it contained proof that he'd been willing to sacrifice his own mother's well-being for money he didn't even need. That knowledge would haunt him long after any legal consequences had been resolved. The locksmith knocked on the door, right on schedule. Derek looked at me pleadingly, but I simply nodded toward the door. He would have to face his co-conspirator and explain why the locks wouldn't be changing after all. Outside, I could hear the man's van idling, his equipment ready to complete a job that was no longer necessary. The sound seemed to underscore just how close Derek had come to succeeding with his plan. Opening the door revealed a tired-looking man in his 50s, carrying a toolbox and a clipboard of his own. "You folks ready to get these locks changed?" he asked cheerfully, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside. Derek started to speak, then looked back at me, then at Cassandra, who was busy texting someone on her phone, probably her lawyer, or possibly her real boyfriend. The web of deception was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. "Actually," Derek said slowly, "there's been a change of plans. We won't be needing your services tonight." The locksmith shrugged, unsurprised. He'd probably seen his share of family disputes and last-minute cancellations. Derek reached for his wallet, but I stopped him with a gesture. This was one bill he wouldn't be paying, at least not with money he'd planned to steal from me. After the locksmith left, the three of us stood in the living room like strangers who'd accidentally wandered into each other's lives. Cassandra was the first to speak, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This isn't over, Derek. We've invested too much time and money in this plan to just walk away now. Your mother is clearly more confused than we thought, if she believes those old papers have any legal standing." Her words revealed more than she intended. The casual reference to investment and time and money confirmed that this scheme had been months in the planning. Derek's gradual shift toward questioning my mental competence hadn't been spontaneous concern. It had been a calculated campaign designed to justify what came next. But Cassandra's biggest mistake was underestimating the legal validity of documents that had been properly notarized and witnessed. Derek's phone rang, interrupting the tense standoff. The caller ID showed his grandmother's former attorney, a man named Robert Graves, who'd handled the family's legal affairs for over 30 years. Derek declined the call, but it rang again immediately. On the third ring, he finally answered, his voice carefully neutral. "Hello, Mr. Graves. What can I do for you?" The attorney's voice was loud enough for all of us to hear, tinny through the phone's speaker. "Derek, I've been trying to reach you for weeks about some irregularities in your grandmother's estate documents. Specifically, some power of attorney papers that don't match our files. I think we need to schedule a meeting as soon as possible to clear this up." Derek's face went ashen as he realized that his document forgeries had been discovered by the one person most qualified to expose them. Ending the call, Derek looked at me with something approaching desperation. The net was tightening around him from multiple directions now. The attorney had discovered the forged documents. I had recorded evidence of his fraud attempt. And Cassandra, his partner in crime, was already positioning herself to abandon him if the situation couldn't be salvaged. 26 years old and facing potential criminal charges because he'd chosen greed over family loyalty. But the secretary desk had one more secret to reveal, one that would determine whether this story ended in justice or tragedy. The largest drawer at the bottom required 2 keys working in sequence, a security measure so complex that even I had needed Tom's grandmother to show me how it operated. Inside were the documents that would either save Derek from himself or condemn him completely, depending on the choice he made in the next few minutes. The bottom drawer slid open to reveal a thick folder labeled Family Trust Documents, Do Not Open Until Emergency. Inside were papers establishing a trust that had been set up decades ago, funded by investments and properties that had appreciated significantly over time. The trust was designed to provide for family members who found themselves in financial difficulty, but it came with one non-negotiable requirement: absolute honesty in all family dealings. Derek's grandmother had anticipated exactly this scenario. A family member who might be tempted to use deception against other family members for financial gain. The trust documents specified that anyone who attempted fraud or manipulation against another beneficiary would forfeit their share permanently. But they also provided a path for redemption, a way for someone who'd made terrible choices to earn their way back into the family's good graces. "Derek," I said, holding the trust documents where he could see them. "Your grandmother knew that money could corrupt people, even good people who started with the best intentions. She also knew that everyone deserves a chance to make things right when they've gone wrong. These papers give you that chance, but only if you're willing to tell the truth about everything you've done." The choice was stark and immediate. Derek could continue with Cassandra's plan, face criminal charges for fraud, and forfeit any chance of inheriting anything from the family estate. Or he could confess his deception, make amends for his betrayal, and potentially access a trust fund worth more than the house he'd been trying to steal. But confession would mean admitting that he'd been willing to betray his own mother, and some admissions change a person forever. Cassandra grabbed Derek's arm, her mask of sympathy finally dropping completely. "Don't listen to her, Derek. She's manipulating you with fake documents and empty promises. We've come too far to back down now. The memory care facility is expecting her tonight, and we've already signed contracts for the house sale. There's no going back." Her desperation was palpable now, the careful planning crumbling around her. Derek pulled his arm free and looked at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Cassandra, did you really think I was stupid enough not to research the memory care facility? I called them this morning. They have no record of any arrangement for my mother. You made that up, just like you made up half the reasons why we needed to do this." The marriage was disintegrating in real time, each revelation stripping away another layer of deception. The trust documents specified exactly what Derek needed to do to qualify for redemption: full disclosure of all fraudulent activities, restitution for any financial losses incurred by other family members, and most importantly, a commitment to ethical behavior in all future family dealings, verified by annual financial audits for 5 years. It was a harsh penalty, but not an impossible one for someone genuinely committed to change. But Cassandra wasn't finished fighting. She pulled out her own phone and began dialing, her voice sharp and threatening. "I'm calling my brother. He's a police officer, and he'll be very interested to hear about an elderly woman who's being financially exploited by someone impersonating her deceased husband's grandmother. This whole thing is elder abuse, and you're all going to jail." Her bluff was desperate and easily disproven, but it revealed how far she was willing to go to salvage their scheme. Derek took the trust documents from my hands and read them carefully, his expression shifting from desperation to something approaching relief. The trust was real, substantial, and offered him a genuine path forward that didn't involve betraying his family or risking criminal prosecution. But it required him to stand up to Cassandra, to admit his mistakes publicly, and to spend years earning back the trust he'd thrown away for a quick financial score. The next hour would determine the rest of Derek's life, and possibly mine as well. He could choose redemption and family reconciliation, or he could double down on deception and face the consequences alone. As I watched him struggle with the decision, I found myself hoping that somewhere inside the man who'd sent that cruel text message, there was still some trace of the little boy who'd once promised to take care of me when I got old. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, appeared at the window, peering through the curtains with undisguised curiosity. She'd probably seen the locksmith's van and wondered what was happening. Mrs. Patterson had been my friend for 15 years, ever since her husband died and left her alone in the house next door. She'd also been witness to Derek's increasingly strange behavior over the past few months, his questions about my mental state and his suggestions that I might need professional help. Derek noticed Mrs. Patterson at the window and realized that their private family drama was about to become neighborhood gossip. The thought seemed to galvanize him, forcing him to confront the reality that his actions had consequences beyond just our family. If he chose to continue with Cassandra's plan, the entire community would eventually know that he'd tried to defraud his own mother. The shame of that public exposure might be worse than any legal penalty. "Cassandra," Derek said quietly, "this is over. I'm not going through with it. My mother was right to be suspicious, and I was wrong to let you convince me that this was necessary. I want you to leave now, and I don't want to see you again unless it's in a lawyer's office discussing divorce proceedings." His voice was steady but exhausted, the voice of someone who'd finally admitted a truth that had been eating at him for months. Cassandra's response was swift and vicious, a stream of accusations and threats that revealed exactly how much contempt she'd always held for both Derek and me. She'd married him for his expected inheritance, nothing more. She'd researched our family's financial situation before their first date. She'd planned this entire scheme before their wedding, seeing Derek as nothing more than a useful tool for accessing what she considered rightfully hers. But as Cassandra raged and threatened, Derek was already moving on, his attention focused on the trust documents and what they required of him. The confession would be painful and humiliating. The restitution might take years to complete, The annual audits would be invasive and embarrassing, but all of it was better than the alternative. Facing criminal charges while watching his inheritance disappear into legal fees and restitution payments. The brass keyring sat on the coffee table between us, no longer a secret weapon, but a symbol of family trust restored. Derek reached for it, then stopped, looking at me with a question in his eyes. I nodded, and he picked up the keys, understanding finally that they represented more than just access to hidden documents. They represented the choice between deception and honesty, between greed and family loyalty. As Cassandra stormed out of the house, her threats and curses echoing in the evening air, Derek and I sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of what had almost happened settled around us like dust after an explosion. In a few hours, I might have been locked out of my own home, declared incompetent by a son I'd raised and trusted. Instead, we were both facing the hard work of rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by months of deception and manipulation. Derek's confession took over an hour, a detailed accounting of every lie he'd told, every document he'd falsified, every manipulation he'd employed to justify what he'd planned to do. Some of it I'd suspected, but much of it was worse than I'd imagined. The systematic campaign to undermine my confidence in my own memory. The fake incidents designed to make me appear confused and helpless. The careful isolation from friends and neighbors who might have questioned his narrative. But perhaps the most painful revelation was how long the deception had been going on. Derek's changed behavior hadn't started 6 months ago when he married Cassandra. It had started over a year ago, shortly after Tom's death, when Derek had begun to see me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to his financial security. The grief I'd attributed to losing his father had actually been frustration at having to wait for his inheritance. The trust documents offered a path forward, but it would require Derek to make amends that went beyond just our family. He would need to confess his deception to the attorney who discovered the forged documents. He would need to reimburse me for the costs I'd incurred in protecting myself from his scheme. And he would need to submit to regular financial audits to ensure that he never again attempted to defraud a family member. As midnight approached, the time when Derek's original plan would have locked me out of my own home, we were instead working together to draft a letter of confession to Mr. Graves, the family attorney. Derek's handwriting was careful and precise, each word chosen to accurately reflect his actions without minimizing their impact. It was, perhaps, the most honest document he'd written in over a year of deception. The brass keyring now sat in its proper place, in the drawer of the secretary desk, where Tom's grandmother had always kept it. But this time, Derek knew where it was and what it represented. The next time he was tempted to choose deception over honesty, he would remember this night and the choice between family and greed that had nearly destroyed everything he claimed to value. Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door at 12:15 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching drama unfold from her window all evening. Derek led her in, and she looked between us with undisguised curiosity and concern. "I saw all the commotion," she said carefully, "and I wanted to make sure everyone was okay. Sometimes family disagreements can get out of hand, especially when people are stressed about money." Her presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that some relationships are built on genuine care rather than financial calculation. Mrs. Patterson had been checking on me regularly since Tom's death, not because she wanted something from me, but because she understood that grief and loneliness could make people vulnerable to those who did want something. She'd probably suspected Derek's intentions long before I'd been willing to admit them to myself. Derek explained the situation to Mrs. Patterson in broad strokes, omitting the most painful details, but acknowledging that he'd made serious mistakes that had nearly cost him his family. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions that helped clarify what had happened. When he finished, she simply said, "Well, it's good that you figured out what really mattered before it was too late. Family is all we really have in the end." The next morning brought a phone call from Mr. Graves, the family attorney, who'd received Derek's confession letter via email at 6 a.m. His voice was grave, but not unsympathetic, as he outlined the legal requirements for resolving the document fraud and the steps Derek would need to take to avoid criminal prosecution. The path forward would be difficult and expensive, but it was still a path forward rather than a dead end. Derek spent the morning calling his bank, his employer, and several other institutions to begin the process of making restitution and establishing the financial transparency required by the trust documents. Each call was a small humiliation, an admission that he'd been willing to commit fraud against his own mother. But each call was also a step toward redemption, toward becoming the kind of man his grandmother had hoped he could be. The trust fund that Derek could now access, assuming he met all the requirements for redemption, was worth considerably more than the house he'd been trying to steal. Tom's grandmother's investments had grown substantially over the decades, carefully managed by professionals who understood her long-term vision for supporting family members in need. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Derek's greed had nearly cost him access to far more money than he'd been trying to steal. But money, as Derek was learning, was never really the point. The trust fund came with strings attached, requirements for ethical behavior and family loyalty that would have prevented him from attempting fraud in the first place. His grandmother had understood that wealth without character was ultimately worthless, and she'd structured her legacy to reward virtue rather than mere blood relationship. 3 months later, Derek's marriage to Cassandra was officially over, dissolved in a proceeding that revealed the extent of her manipulation and fraud. She'd been married twice before, both times to men with substantial inheritances that she'd helped them access and spend. Derek had been her third target, but unlike her previous victims, he'd had family members who were willing and able to fight back. The house remained mine, of course, secured by legal documents that no amount of fraud could overcome. But more importantly, the relationship between Derek and me was slowly healing, built now on honesty rather than the casual deceptions that had nearly destroyed us both. He visited twice a week, not to check on my mental state or probe for signs of vulnerability, but simply to spend time with his mother and rebuild the trust he'd thrown away. The secretary desk's secrets were now shared between us, its hidden compartments no longer mysterious, but simply part of our family's history of protecting what mattered most. Derek had learned to use the brass keyring properly, understanding finally that some treasures can't be stolen because they belong to those who earn them through loyalty and love. The recording of that terrible evening remained on my phone, not as a weapon to use against Derek, but as a reminder of how quickly trust can be shattered and how much work it takes to rebuild it. Sometimes I played it back, listening to Cassandra's voice as she tried to manipulate Derek into betraying his family. It served as a vaccination against future deception, a reminder that evil often comes disguised as practical necessity. Mrs. Patterson became a regular visitor, joining us for dinner twice a week and serving as an unofficial witness to Derek's transformation. She'd lived through her own family betrayals decades earlier and understood the delicate work of forgiveness and redemption. Her presence helped normalize our new relationship, providing a neutral observer who could confirm that change was real rather than performed. The memory care facility that Cassandra had invented as cover for their scheme became, ironically, the recipient of a substantial donation from the family trust. Derek suggested it as part of his restitution, a way of turning their lie into something positive. The facility used the money to establish a program for detecting and preventing elder abuse, particularly financial exploitation by family members. As I write this story almost a year later, Derek has successfully completed his first annual financial audit and is well on his way to earning full access to his grandmother's trust. More importantly, he's earned back my trust and his own self-respect. The man who sent that cruel text message demanding I pack my bags has been replaced by someone who understands the difference between what we want and what we deserve. The brass keyring still sits in the secretary desk, waiting for the next emergency that requires family members to stand together against those who would divide them. Tom's grandmother's wisdom in creating layers of protection for her family has been vindicated. Her paranoia about hidden enemies proven justified by events she couldn't have predicted but somehow prepared for. Some stories end with justice served cold and enemies vanquished completely. This story ends with something more valuable: a family restored, trust rebuilt, and the understanding that redemption is possible even after the worst betrayals. Derek's keys work in all the right locks now, not because he stole them, but because he earned them back through the hardest work of all, becoming worthy of the love he'd nearly thrown away. If you're dealing with family members who seem to have changed, who question your competence, or push for decisions that benefit them more than you, remember that trust is earned through actions, not words. Keep your own keys, document what matters, and never forget that some secrets are worth keeping until the moment they're needed most. Family loyalty should flow both ways, and anyone who demands blind trust while offering deception in return has revealed exactly who they really are. The text message that started this nightmare remains in my phone, a permanent reminder of how close I came to losing everything I'd worked for my entire life. But next to it now are dozens of messages from Derek, apologies and updates, and simple expressions of love that prove people can change when they choose to do the hard work of becoming better. Sometimes the keys to redemption are the same keys that nearly locked us out of grace, and the only difference is who we choose to be when we're holding them.